Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here today, and today we are mixing things up a bit. I'm outside because we're going outside the world of books into the world of games, and specifically Nier Automata. I don't think I can do a full analysis of this game, but I was thinking about it last night, and we had a series of I had a series of revelations vis-a-vis the themes in Automata, and also how they related to their characters and philosophers. As you know, in Automata, they tend to name drop a lot of philosophers, from Immanuel Kant to Pascal and a bunch of other ones. So I decided, since I've actually read some of this stuff in my channel, I could relate it into the game, and how accurate or not accurate are these interpretations or name drops or philosophies set into Automata. One of the prevailing themes throughout Automata, or the duality of themes, is purpose versus not purpose, of God versus not God, of nihilism versus belief. And in the opening sequence, it kind of lays this out very much in front of us, where 2B is complaining about being stuck in a cycle of death and rebirth, and of struggle, and wondering if she'll be able to kill the god who put them in the cycle. Spoiler alert, she does. In a way, it's interesting. It's funny, you know, the Yorha androids, while the machines, they have Emmanuel, they have Kierkegaard, they have Marx and Engels, and all these other characters. It's funny, these are all kind of Enlightenment thinkers, and while there's no prevailing name or ideal on the Yorha android side, it seems very clear they're very much inspired by Nietzsche. The whole Uberman nihilist stereotype is very much a Yorha android philosophy. It's interesting because in the Yorha world, their god literally is humanity. They are literally worshiping the human race as their god. They were created for the purpose of saving humanity on the moon and restoring the earth to them. It's an interesting concept, because that's very much in line with Nietzsche's Uberman, that man should worship mankind, man should worship himself and become a Uberman, or a bridge to a greater person, that without God, without purpose, we can simply just ascend endlessly, is the idea. We don't need the help or the illusion of a God to help us, that we can simply worship humanity in itself, and through the will and the will to power that would manifest itself. And you see this in Yorha. They are a technically not imperialists, because humanity or Earth was their homeland, but they are highly militarized, collectivized, and highly socialized group, to the point where it's odd that they have this will to power mentality, yet each individual within the Yorha is only designated by a 2 or 2B, or a letter number designation. They don't actually have names, and yet at the same time they have nicknames. One of the concepts that I might go into in another video, but in the original Nier, the whole concept of the original Nier was that, in Gestalt, was that is it possible for a soul to manifest in a non-souled creature? Is it possible that a soul could be created? And there's very much this running theme throughout Automata, which is pretty obvious, which is that, can something that looks and acts human actually be human? And that's not just from the android side, but also from the machine side, because the machines tend to mimic and take on, mimic other humans once they're disconnected from the network. It's interesting how both of these systems, the machines and Yorha, operate on this kind of highly socialized system. They're both collective systems in the same way the communism and fascism are. And I liken, the Yorha to more fascists, while the machines are more communists. In Yorha, you have a hierarchy, you have a commander, you have operators, you have humanity as the kind of god they're fighting for. So it's a very top-down structure, but it's still highly collective, which is why the androids are not supposed to go throughout, outside their programming. They're not supposed to do this, not supposed to do that. They're basically trying not to be humans while at the same time tragically becoming humans. And it's funny how, 2B and 9S, they constantly come into contact with machines who are emulating human behavior or are somehow acting more human than even they are. And it's this funny thing because humanity is extinct, so they don't really know what a human is. And so they're trying to understand what this existence or experience is, and when they're confronted with things that act more human than they do, or that whatever, or that humans would, at least the humans in their mind, it's kind of shocking. And it's kind of again, to the whole thing, like, kind of soul manifest inside a non-human thing. It's the ending A is all about that, where essentially 9S's consciousness or data is stored onto the system, and he transfers himself into a machine. And it's very interesting too, because the other running line is that your memories make you who you are, and without your memories, that's why it's so tragic that 9S keeps dying when he can't upload his data, or the servers are down, because then he loses all that data. And apparently, according to the spoilers, this has been happening in many, many cycles, that humanity finds out the truth and then collapses, or civilization collapses, and they have to rediscover the truth over and over and over again. And sometimes the truth is that there is no God, or that there's a will to power, or that one has to manifest one's own destiny. Kind of like Voltaire, if there were no God, it would be necessary to create him. I think that term, or that quote alone, pretty much summarizes Automata for me, honestly. But back to the social structure. So while the Yorha are a very top-down organization, the machines exist on a network where it seems like all the machines are equal, and they all have the equal imperative of destroying the human world or the human civilization, and at the same time wanting to mimic them. There doesn't seem to be any hierarchy, seemingly at first, of course, but it turns out there is a hierarchy that is just hidden behind the shadows that not even the machines know about. But it seems like all the machines, it's this, if Nietzsche is kind of the individual, the will to power, the self, or the man manifesting and taking over the known world, the machines, because they are technically aliens, it's interesting, they're all modeled exactly the same. They do have different classes, like the big ones and the small ones, but the small ones, they are, a more of a John Locke tabula rasa. If Yorha is all about nature and the nature of humanity and the simple being of one thing, it's the machines who believe or emulate the trope of nurture. It doesn't matter. All the machines are essentially built all the same. It's just the cultures that they're exposed to. And it's interesting because you go throughout the game and there's, the desert machines, the Kierkegaard's factory machines. Once the machines disconnect from the network, that's only when they have a different kind of philosophy or idea of how to exist. But you'll see that as you go throughout each location, the machines kind of adapt themselves to the environment, and that's the only variation between them. And it's the machines, of course, in the deepest darkness, and the caves that are the hardest in the game, more or less. And of course, throughout the story of the game, you have different machines that disconnect from the network, and they create their own identities and their own system and their own theory of belief and existence. And it's interesting too, because it's kind of a reflection of humanity, of the different ways in which humans have tried to justify or explain their existence. So, for example, the Forest Kingdom, they all serve Emmanuel. And I can go into each of these now, I guess, or one by one. But Emmanuel is based off Immanuel Kant. And it's interesting that he's just a baby. And they all have this hope that he's going to become the Forest King, that he's going to become this thing that they can justify their existence on. Again, I don't know how much I've read. If I can, properly distill all these hard concepts into very bite-sized idea. I don't know if Yoko Taro just went on the wiki page and he just, name dropped this thing. But for the Forest Kingdom itself, that culture, that society, they're kind of, they're militaristic. Obviously, they're feudal. But it's interesting that he chose Kant as a baby, as a kind of harmless or useless thing, really, that they're hoping on that it would become something. And the only kind of tongue-in-cheek remark I can make on that is that no one can actually read Kant and understand him to actually properly create a useful idea. it's I don't know if it's a running joke in philosophy, but you can read Kant and it's very difficult to read him and understand him, to the point where even if he is a genius, no one really understands or can distill what he means into a practical concept. One example of what Kant wrote about is categorical imperatives, the types of knowledge that you can think of. You have a priori knowledge, empirical knowledge, and it all exists in a subset. And he kind of made the claim, which is logical, that is practical, that the kind of knowledge that we need to go towards or try to grasp is sort of a priori empirical knowledge, I believe. It's something that is universal and also measurable and repeatable. So something that, in the scientific sense, if you measure gravity here, it's going to be the same over there and over there and over there, and that the principle and the measurement is consistent across the universe, and we can use it. And that's at least my understanding of at least one of his things he's written about. But it's interesting that A2 comes and just stabs and does away with him, because no one can actually understand anything he's saying. I think it'd be better if it was like a babbling robot that spoke in riddles that they thought was really smart, but no one could actually understand him. I don't know, but maybe there's another reason why Kant is depicted as a baby. Again, I scripted this a little bit last night, but I'm just spitballing here. Let's move on to Kierkegaard real quick, since that's the other robot or machine society. So they all decide to disconnect from the network, and Kierkegaard essentially commits suicide, and they all kind of follow him, and they chant "Become as gods." This is, funny enough, this is more of a Nietzsche kind of thing, because Nietzsche was kind of like, well, God is dead, therefore we shall become God. That's the whole concept of Nietzsche. Without religion, we shall be free, and we shall become God himself. And so it's funny that, they become God, but not in the Nietzsche way. They become God in the, traditional Christian way, where, God dies and he transcends death. But in the way, it's so funny, because the way Kierkegaard writes about his leap of faith is that, I'm not sure if it's in Fear and Trembling, but I really think this is more of a leap of faith thing than a Fear and Trembling thing. But in the leap of faith, it's like Kierkegaard essentially says, oh no, I'm sorry, this is the same thing, that the solution to Fear and Trembling, and specifically, so Fear and Trembling and Kierkegaard really focuses on the Isaac Abraham story, where he's going to kill his son, that God said is going to be the inheritor of nations. And it's the most kind of Christ-like moment in the Old Testament. Maybe don't hold me to that, but it's he's going to sacrifice his son, right? And it's a whole hyper analysis of this moment, of this one act, where it's like, I'm going to do the one thing that makes no sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense. But it's about faith overcoming logic. It's about belief overcoming logic and stepping into a higher mode of existence of belief and faith, and even if it's blind. And it's the fear and the trembling that both Isaac and Abraham experience in this moment. That is like, I can't believe I'm really going to do this. And it's kind of like in that uncertainty, in that great fear, it's like faith comes out. And apparently it's it's depending on how you translate, it's not a leap of faith, it's a step of faith, apparently. And some priests like to emphasize that it's not that big of a deal anyway. But anyway, so Kierkegaard basically says, you just have to have faith and kind of step over the edge. And it's very funny that this Kierkegaard God character, I mean, the robot character, it's unfortunate that we don't really get to see a lot of him and understand what his motives are, what his ideas are, because you show up and he just dies. It's just like, so it's like, I guess he took a leap of faith. I'm sure there's a side story that goes into more detail, but I'm just going off the game. I don't have time to read all the CD dramas and everything, Anyway, so Kierkegaard ends up just committing suicide or dying or something. And so the machines kind of have created this theocracy, and they're following him as their prophet. And he obviously had said things before this, and so his leap of faith into death was kind of his assurance that they were going to be all right. And it's kind of funny how it takes and misinterprets, the Christian sacrifice and the Christian death of Christ, and it turns it into, it removes all meaning from it. It's like the act in itself, if I just emulate these actions without the purpose or the reason behind it, then it will be our salvation or our faith that will save us. And it's obviously not the case. And so then all the machines chant become as gods, and it's again another sort of lesson or reinforcement of the theme of collectivization versus individualism. Not only are 2B and 9S throughout the story trying to understand what humanity is, what it means to be human, but also what it means to be an individual, what it means to be 9S versus 9s, what it means to be 2B versus Tubes. I don't think she has a nickname, does she? Just 2B. Or not to be. Yes, it is meant to be that. So the aspect of individualism versus collectivization is funny, because even though Yorha is technically more individualistic, they are also highly collectivized in their individual identity. It's kind of like they have that Yorha is a thing, while the machines are just the machines. They don't really have an identity. They just have the collectivization and the destruction of and tearing down of the androids of humanity and of Earth, simply because that's what they were programmed to do, and to the point where no one knows any longer why they're actually fighting. The meaning and the point has actually been lost, which is very apt. And so anyway, and all the machines mass suicide, and it's very much like a Heaven's Gate scenario. And that kind of is that kind of society. But it's interesting how each of the machines, once they disconnect from the network, once they disconnect from their collective, they're trying to find a reason and a purpose to live. And each of these societies, from Emmanuel to Kierkegaard, are kind of like, what if there was a society that was based on an Enlightenment thinker, and it was just their philosophy that was like in charge of the whole society? Would they find the purpose to exist? And that question is being asked over and over and over again. Interestingly, I guess it doesn't really tackle that question for some of the thinkers. For example, it's very, very kind of obvious up front, where the very first boss that you do actually fight in the general world or the overworld, the giant claw, or giant buzzsaw rather, is called Marx, and the giant kind of Goliath is called Engels. And I think it is perhaps intentional or not, maybe, that the larger machines are called Goliath class machine, which is more of a biblical reference, obviously, the Goliath class machines. But it's a question of why would they call it Marx and Engels? And it's funny because, of course, when they combine, they become Marx and Engels. And, for those of you who don't know, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and Engels also funded it and co-wrote it with him. And so it was the entire idea that every struggle is a class struggle, private property does not exist, We have to take down the bourgeoisie. We have to take down the hierarchies, essentially. And Yorha and the humanity represents that hierarchy, and to kind of turn everything into, rubble. And, it's funny that the machines that are using this philosophy, or well, they're not using that specific philosophy, but the machines that represent that are just aliens sent to destroy humanity. They're not there to build anything. They're just there to destroy. And so I like to think of it, when Marx and Engels combine, they create the means of destruction. Anyway, but anyway, so that's another aspect to the machines, how they represent this sort of social conformism, but without as much of identity. So they feel more, I don't want to say straight up, communist, but I guess that's, one way to look at it. They're a collective, essentially. They're like the Borg or whatever. It's also important to note that the machines themselves, in terms of taking down hierarchies and whatnot, they did kill their masters, their alien masters. And so I think that also adds to the aspect of destroying hierarchies, destroying masters, and becoming free, but as a collective, so that everyone's equal, all the machines look the same, they all act the same, etc. And yet they still have this yearning for individuality and for a soul, essentially, what it means to be human. And of course, it depends on how much you know about history. The other kind of relation that runs down this line is when you finally figure out at the end of Route C who has been orchestrating all of this, which is N2. And it's funny that N2 not isn't only in control of Yorha, but also the machines. She is kind of behind the scenes of the whole thing, creating conflict after conflict, in a form of evolution, because she can't persist without new life forms, new ideas, new concepts, and new struggles. And it's like the most highest concepts exist in the most desperate of struggles. There can't be peace. There has to be conflict. There has to be disorder. There has to be war, to the point where no one even knows what they're fighting for anymore, and she is controlling both sides of the board. It's interesting, the last kind of Enlightenment philosopher name drop that you have in this, there's also Grun, which is the giant fish boss, but I read the name, I read a little bit of his story. He was also a contributor to the early communist Marxist movement, but I didn't feel it necessary to really read up on him. You can do that if you want. But the more interesting one is the giant ball one that moves in a circle. It's actually called Hegel. And that's really interesting because Hegel was a huge influence on Marx and German Enlightenment in general. He came up with Dialectics, and I swear to God, I'll just be upfront, I have read what Dialectics is maybe 5 or 6 times, and every single time I get a different interpretation of what this guy's talking about. But for my most recent reading of it, Dialectics basically is the concept that there's dialectics kind of means a duality of conversation between two things, and a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis, which is a compromise almost between these two ideas, which then leads to a new zeitgeist, if you will, and then a new form of thesis, because the synthesis becomes a thesis, and then you have a new antithesis which will be created. And this, at least the way I interpreted it, isn't just a localized argument between two people, but a cultural conflict, if you will. In the 40s, it was communists versus Nazis. In the Cold War period, it shifted into socialists and communists versus American imperialism. And so every time an empire falls or one guy bows out, like when the Soviets collapsed in the 90s, a new zeitgeist, a new frame of thinking is established, and then a new hero and anti-hero is born, essentially, or which philosophy or concept will defeat the other, so to speak. Anyway, that's what my current reading of it was. So it's interesting because in Nier, it is very obviously a crypto nihilist fascist, and Nietzsche was a huge influence on German fascism, I guess you could say. I could read more into it, but I just it's just an odd fact of history. This is a fact that when they sent the German soldiers to war in World War One, they gave them a copy of the Gospel by John, I think, John, or one of the Gospels, but they also gave them a copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra, which, why? I'm really confused by this little fact of history. Like, why would you give a soldier on the front lines of a war a book about nihilism? It does not sound like a good idea. Maybe it's the whole become the Uberman part, but the whole thing is like, there is no God, so you're not fighting for anything. It was just, what? Wild? Anyway, and I guess, a lot of soldiers of that war obviously went on to, form the Nationalist Party in Germany after that. So I can't help but think indirectly or directly that Nietzsche influenced a lot of that sort of fascist thinking. Anyway, and then, so the dialectic here is that kind of imperialistic, individualistic Nietzschean nihilism versus a more just kind of Marx communistic collective. And so it's really not, essentially, it's not super political, but it's very conceptual. It's about hierarchies and will to power taking over collectives and then victimization, maybe. In any case, and so these two competing forces are fighting to see what is the synthesis, and I think that's what N2 is after. N2 is after a new concept or a new ideal or a new form of human evolution, which is, of course, not a parody, a metaphor for the 20th century and its kind of conflicts, and what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to have purpose? And so it's a reflection of the last 100 years of history really has been that struggle. I think not really an aside, but one of the characters that really affected me personally was the wise machine. Because the wise machine, again, another singular machine that disconnects from the network, and as you read it, and it's always thinking, it's never doing anything, it's just always standing there looking out at space, and when 9S hacks it, it reveals things like it is obsessed with truth and what is truth. And it's interesting that it goes off with this tangent that truth is the only thing that matters, truth is the ultimate and highest form of pursuit, and that's very much what the Enlightenment thinkers believe. They believe that truth was the ultimate kind of, the highest point, the acme, the apex of existence. That if you could define and rule and create truth, then you could find purpose and meaning in existence. And of course, what happens to the wise machine is that, ironically, despite being so wise, he ends up realizing that, the truth is that you're trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth and struggle, as 2B said, and that you were designed to fight and die, which is what 2B said, like the soldiers of World War I, I guess. And so he comes to the conclusion that, the truth is that, you are, he says, unloved. And then he jumps off the cliff and commits suicide. And it's a very intense moment, I would say. Maybe for other people it wasn't, but it was just like, yeah, if you take nihilistic, godless, and just simple Enlightenment empirical thinking to its axiom, the conclusion is that, there is no purpose. You can't think your way into purpose. And I don't think Nier tackles this problem very well. Like, well, what is purpose? Well, it's other people. Oh, maybe. But it essentially it pursues this line of thinking to such an extreme that it results in death. And that's very interesting because there's another very funny scene, and I didn't appreciate it until I read more about Nietzsche, that Pascal, and I totally forgot to talk about Pascal in their village, but anyway, Pascal is in her village, or his village, I'm not sure what Pascal's sex or gender is, but the whole scene where, I watched it, and when the state ceaseth, so then becomes the time of the man of the individual, or something like that. And she says, wow, this Nietzsche fellow really was quite a thinker. And then she goes on to say, I'm not sure if he's really smart or if he just went straight to crazy. And it's really funny because I feel like that's pretty much what the real Pascal would say about Nietzsche. Because I did my review on Pensée just a little while ago. And so it's interesting how you have the Enlightenment thinkers that are still Christian, like Kierkegaard, and the ones that are more secular, essentially, and their lines of thought. And so, Pascal's notes are filled with things, the real Pascal and Pensée thoughts. They're always filled with things about, how God reveals himself through numbers, through nature, how it's like almost self-evident that if God did not exist, numbers would not work. That if there was not a rational thinker of existence, then therefore existence wouldn't make sense. And it's kind of the kind of related or unrelated. I was watching this talk about that Enlightenment era in general, which is essentially that. I'm not sure if it started with Descartes, but it was the guy who pushed everything off the table and decided, what can we rely on? And it has to be after Descartes. Anyway, it was the general idea that, okay, the only way we can be certain of something and establish a scientific method of understanding the world is by using our senses and our mind. And then it's like the postmodern extrapolation of that idea is, well, how can you trust your senses and your mind? How can you trust the very tools you've been given to perceive the world? What if your tools are flawed? And so that underlying theory means that, if you saw a different color every time you looked at a red door or something, for example, or if you touched something, it was a different sensation every time you touched something, if there was variance in your senses, how could you ever possibly come to know what the world is? And so the idea is that, the postmodernist idea that there is no meaning, everything's relative, that, the world and evolution was just a bunch of amino acids that just randomly formed, just doesn't seem plausible given the amount of strange consistencies. And so it's a, I guess, argument for the spiritual that, for us to have a consistent understanding and scientific understanding of the world, we are using our minds and our perception to do that. And the implication is that the world itself was also created by some being that also had consistency of perception, and that our minds and brains and bodies were created to understand the world through our senses. It's funny that we weren't just born in space. Obviously, we wouldn't exist, but that fact that we live in a reality where we can make meaningful decisions, that we can actually see difference and variance and degree of differences and draw consistent conclusions, that I know every time I step on the ground, it's going to be stable. And so the idea is that, someone who also has rules and consistencies in a seemingly otherwise totally chaotic universe created it. It's, the chances and extrapolation of the Earth being where it is, being exactly away from the sun where it is so astronomically high or low in terms of probability, that it almost doesn't make any logical sense comparatively. Anyway, I forgot where I was going with this. But anyway, Pascal is more, at least in his philosophy, he definitely is more cheerful. He's more, I guess, it's like, it's self-evident. And his whole Pascal's wager, it's the argument for God. Perhaps rare amongst the Enlightenment thinkers, but Kierkegaard does it in the same way, just in a very depressed, goth, emo, Nordic way. But Pascal was French, and he was kind of like, oh yes, of course, God exists. It is, n'est pas problème, and very much so that, he made his wager, which is that, in a mathematically stable, system, you have better chances at happiness and salvation to believe in God than to not, because he basically has a 4-part quadrant where it's like, well, if you're wrong, then you still win, and if you're right, you still win. And if there is no God, but you live like there is, then you also still win. So you only lose if you don't believe in God and you're right. And then you lose. But it's like, of the 3 other scenarios, you win. So he's like, there's no actually mathematical, logical reason to not believe. And I don't know, it's interesting. And so Pascal, appropriately, is this very nice robot. She is this robot who essentially creates this village, takes care of the other robots, and tries to nourish them and nurture them and teach them, and has a thirst for knowledge. And it's generally just a nice machine. I don't know why she looks different than all the other ones. I'm not sure if that was just a design choice of like, hey, this NPC is important, or if there's something more meaning to that. And either way, Pascal is more of an individual amongst the other machines than it, obviously. Of course, Pascal's arc is not a happy ending, because it's interesting that when the machines are under siege, Pascal is teaching them about humanity and whatever, and what happens is the machines all commit suicide because they think they're going to die, and they'd rather die by their own hands, I guess, was the logic there. And so Pascal just collapses and basically says, oh, I taught them about fear. This is my fault. And it's a very very interesting moment, because it's the idea that, again, that the machines are all tabula rasa, that you can train them, teach them to be soldiers or whatever, or do anything, and in the sense of teaching them to be human, you can teach them something that is not useful to them, that makes them want to destroy themselves, like the wise machine. But it's not out of rationale that they die, it's out of an emotional state, which is fear. And so Pascal blames herself for this tragedy. It's a very strange thing. I don't think Pascal actually talks about fear or life and death at all in his book, but he's very, very much positive. I guess Pascal's a he in the game. I don't know. And so it's very much kind of like Adam and Eve kind of scenario, where if you have the knowledge of a certain thing, it can actually lead you to die. If you have a certain programming, if you have a certain way of being, it can result in actually negative outcomes. And if anything, I think this whole scenario with this mass suicide reminds me more of Kierkegaard, where it's the fear and the trembling and the step into death or beyond death, and the fear of living and the fear of being hurt and abused kind of comes into play. And it's more of a Kierkegaard kind of scenario, which is funny. But essentially the machines, they kill themselves because they can't stand this reality, and their fear drives them to do this. And it's interesting too, because right after this, it's similar, because Kierkegaard, again, it's the whole thing where you have to have faith into death, basically. And it's kind of like, if you have too much faith or too much fear or too much of one thing, it can be negative in that way. But anyway, the part right after this is interesting, because Pascal, you were given the choice to erase Pascal's memories or not. And if you do erase her memories, it's a very brutal aftermath. But But if you don't erase Pascal's memories, then I think she just goes on, I don't think she actually kills herself. But it's interesting though, again, the nurture, the memories that create who we are. It's not just a matter of how you're treated that constructs your psyche, but it's if you take that away from someone, they kind of become a tabula rasa. And it's a terrifying thought, in the John Locke world. What if you could just erase someone's memories? What if you could just erase everything about them? Would they still be the same person? And of course, the sick part is that if you do erase Pascal's memory, she reverts to the same happy, cheerful robot that she always is. She's just selling the body parts of her village that she doesn't understand what they are, which is really messed up. And that again loops back into what are 9S and 2B composed of. Their black boxes are made of machine cores because they're all made by N2 or roughly, and so it's again what the composition is of a being, what their nature is versus what their nurture is. And just because, I think it's such a for the player, it's like, okay, 9S, your stuff is made of the same thing as the machine, so what? And I think you have to think about 9S's perspective from this, that Yorha is created, their nature is to be created as the saviors of humanity. Their function is to be this thing, and that is sort of this Uberman over all others. And when he finds out he's composed of the same material as the things he's been killing, it kind of is a shock for him in that sense. For us, the player, it's like, whatever, right? But it's interesting to take it from his perspective, why that's such a shocking revelation, why it's such a big deal. And of course, that brings us finally to the last two machines, Adam and Eve. Of course, the main kind of antagonists of the game, or at least at first. I'm not really sure what to make of these two because they just don't have a lot of similarities to Adam and Eve from the Bible. I think everyone pretty much knows the story. I'm really not sure what to say. I mean, Adam obviously has a huge desire for knowledge, obviously, and Eve is kind of just, whatever. That's pretty much the only similarity I get from these two. The only other, thing is that obviously by the end of the game, they build something. I think it's in the game, it's called the Ark, and they're building this ship essentially to go into space with all of humanity's genetic data, all of the genetic data of the animals. It's a digital ark essentially that would go out and seed another planet and hopefully rebuild humanity from the materials there, along with the consciousness of Adam and Eve. So it's kind of like the Ark story and the casting out of Eden story all kind of wrapped up into one. It's interesting though, before that Adam disconnects himself from the network because he's obsessed with what it means to be human. He wants to know so badly he's willing to die, which when I think about it, that makes way more sense that Eve would do that, because Eve was the one who was tempted. Eve in this one, the Eve in Automata, just whatever. He's just like, I love my brother. That's it. I don't know. I think it would be cooler, Mr. Taro, if Eve was the one who was obsessed with becoming human, with knowing, in the way that 9S was. It makes more sense, honestly, if 9S was called Eve and 2B was Adam. That actually makes a lot more sense, because 9S is obsessed with knowing and knowledge and tempted by knowledge to the extent that he's willing to sacrifice his position with the commander, his position as a scanner unit, his relationship with 2B and his assignment with 2B to some extent, to find out the truth. And of course it always results in him dying. Anyway, but Adam and Eve are there, they exist, and they are constantly evolving. And it's more like Adam and Eve have the fruit of life than the fruit of knowledge, because they really can't die, or it's very hard to kill them, and they keep evolving and becoming this increasingly upward Uberman in a weird way. And they replicate humanity in the same way the androids do, but they don't know why. They don't have any purpose, and that's why they're both searching for purpose, to the extent Adam's willing to die for it. Again, I think it should have been Eve, but but whatever. It is what it is. And because Eve's the one who's tempted first. And I think it's really interesting, I guess, at least in the biblical story, what went through Eve's mind? What if there was a huge delay between giving Adam the apple, that she knows what she's done and she brings him down with her? I think that'd be a much more interesting concept, that Adam finds out, or Eve finds out, and deliberates giving it to Eve. Because Eve in the game is very much like a pre-fall human. He just kind of goes around, wants to be with his brother, and when he's dead, then he goes crazy. Honestly, it makes almost more sense to call these two Cain and Abel, and to call 2B and 9S Adam and Eve. I think that to me makes more sense. I know Adam doesn't kill Eve or vice versa, the guys from the game, but it would just be cooler, I feel. I don't know, it makes more sense to me. Anyway, that's my feedback, Mr. Taro. Anyway, but essentially that's the arc, and they were created, of course, by N2 to again to create humanity and to create evolution and to create this thing of what is purpose, what is meaning. And I think N2 at this point has basically taken over everything to the extent that she needs to find a purpose herself to keep going. And we as the player kind of get to see this as a bunch of existential, philosophical battles, which is really cool. And so this finally brings us to the final act of the game, where the ship has left. I think there's multiple endings actually, if 9S joins them or not, if A2 decides to just destroy the tower and the Ark. But I guess the canon ending is that 9S and 2B's consciousness is copied over or joins them on the Ark, or doesn't, because then the system reboots them and then they're still alive. Anyway, so ending E, the pods are like, okay, everything's going to be reset, everything's going to be rebooted, we're going to erase all memories and all traces of the Yorha project, and also the machines, I guess, and just destroy everything as, the Ark leaves or doesn't. And so it kind of becomes this meta moment, and I love these in games, where it asks the player, do you want to try to save and fight the system? Do you want to fight, essentially, the reality of the game world? And so it's this interesting point where, we've had this conversation about purpose and God and reason for existence. And it's kind of like, after seeing the struggles of these two characters, do you care enough to do this stupid bullet hell minigame to try and save them? That's basically impossible until you get help. And so it's this interesting thing that you are literally fighting Yoko Taro, you are fighting Okaba, you are fighting the credits of the game, you are fighting the creators and essentially the gods of this world, even above N2, you are fighting the creators of this world. And in a weird way, it's like we are also God. And I love that trope. It only happens in a few games. It happens in Nier, happens in One Shot, and One Shot's very direct about this. And I love One Shot because you talk to the character when he closes his eyes and he prays. He has this sort of fixed dialogue, and depending on what name you put, of course you'll say your name or whatever. But this idea that we are simply observing this universe as a means to get meaning and purpose for ourselves. I think that's really what Yoko Taro wanted to tackle with this game, is that what is meaning, what is purpose, and these are all the, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to be human? Can you be too human? Can you be not human enough? And Taro obviously borrowed from all of the philosophical thinkers of the past few centuries that have tackled this question and tried to put them all in a game. At least that's what I think he was trying to do, and have all of these ideas and concepts fight each other and have the winner kind of come out. And so in the final process, it's kind of like, do you want to save the characters of this experience? And so you go up against the credits themselves, and you as the player, you're given the tools to defeat them, but still it's not enough. And the only way you can get to the end of this save data and to the end of this sequence is by sacrificing your save data and taking other players' save datas. And it's such a cool thing. It reminds me, for some reason, of Bach, because Bach created music specifically for church, for people to all sing in harmony and create this song or this creation where people praise God in a communal way, in a way that everyone can participate in and add their voices. And of course, if you know that everyone in the cast and the studio actually sang in that final rendition of the credits. And so it really reminds me of that concept, that we are singing or fighting to save these characters because we've grown attached to them, that despite their attempts to be non-human or attempts to be what they thought they should be, we love the fact how their humanity and their soul manifested in them, that despite their fakeness and their fictionality to us, they feel more real to us because they've been created for us to observe and derive meaning from their story and from their plight. And in that sense, it's like a soul has manifested in that person through their struggles, which is, at the end of the day, a very Christian idea. And so, we are given the choice, again, in the Christian ideal, we sacrifice our memories, we sacrifice our save data, we sacrifice our experiences in order to give someone else the same experience. And we do it, I think, out of a place of love rather than truth. We do this because it's part of the experience, and because it's a way, it's the idea that, is this worth giving up your time and your effort in the hopes that someone else can have a chance to experience the same thing? And you can even leave your little message behind. And it's a really beautiful concept, honestly. And it's such it's more of a socialized collective concept that we're all coming together, but we're all coming together for the purpose of truth and of love and existence itself. That it's the famous last line before that sequence, which is that, do you think games are silly little things? And no, it's games, and specifically games like the ones that Mr. Taro makes, specifically they tell stories, and they create stories which in turn give purpose itself. And so in that way, I think a reason for living or existing is to wait for Nier Automata 2 or Nier 3 or whatever the hell you want to, however you want to put it, because these stories and these struggles essentially give us purpose through living them vicariously and observing them. And I think that's what, intentionally or not, this game is trying to convey. And I love this game. I love this game's story. I love how it presents itself. And I love games that are like it. And I love games that can tell stories in so impactful ways, because we're in control of the characters. We are animating their life. We are, the story does not move forward without us. And so in a way, it is a very kind of God creation relationship. I created you so that I could have meaning myself. That's something people do believe, that God created, or someone created this universe in order for them to simulate every possible outcome and then derive a meaning for themselves. And this is kind of crossing into Final Fantasy XIV. I don't want to go there yet. Maybe I'll do that next. But that's I don't know. I think that's basically everything I wanted to cover here. But yeah, it ends in us giving a sacrifice and sending that experience to someone else, and having that purpose and that thing derive in us, and to extend that meaning to others. And ultimately, while a Japanese game developer isn't a spiritual or intellectual philosopher, I think what they actually do is they extend that story of meaning and truth beyond themselves as a product and as an experience, and do more work than probably actual real philosophers today, or something. I don't know. But yeah, that is basically my interpretation of Nier. That is the most close kind of, from what I've read from these authors, how much I can, interpret and add to their placement in the game. And yeah, I love Nier. It's a good game, and all it's known for is 2B's ass. So there's a little bit more, there's layers here. It's not just about the leotard, rest assured. Anyway, that's it. And as always, guys, always keep reading and gaming, I guess, as well. I'll see you later. Bye.